డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ సార్వత్రిక విశ్వవిద్యాలయం విద్యార్థులకు స్వాగతం.
Today we are going to discuss a very important topic of audit procedure. To put it in one sentence, audit procedure begins with the appointment of the auditor and it ends with the auditor giving the audit report. Now, whatever happens in between, that is appointment of the auditor and his giving an audit report, that constitutes the audit procedure. I have broken down this subject under different heads so as to make it easier to remember and to reproduce in the examination. Before the actual audit procedure starts, the first thing which the auditor has to see is whether the appointment, his appointment as an auditor is valid, whether it has been legally made or not. Once he gets a confirmation on this, he can proceed with the audit. Now, as far as audit appointment is concerned, it all depends on the nature of audit, on the nature of the audit entity. For instance, if it is a company audit, then the auditor is appointed by the shareholders, except of course the first auditor who is appointed by the board of directors. Now, he has to obtain a letter from the company stating that a general body meeting has been held on such and such date and he has been appointed as the auditor. If it is any other audit, for instance, there is an audit under the Sales Tax Act, there is an audit under the Income Tax Act. Now, for these things, an approval by the general body of shareholders is not required. So, he only has to take a letter from the board of directors, that would be sufficient. Again, as I said, it also depends on the nature of audit. If it is a statutory audit and if it is a company audit, then the shareholders approval is a must. But if it is an internal audit, then it is not necessary that the shareholders should approve it. The board of directors or the committee which is appointed for audit, it can take a decision and it can give an appointment letter to the auditor. Now, once the auditor satisfies himself that his appointment is in order, he has to proceed with the actual audit. Now, the procedure again starts. What do you do as soon as you have an appointment? The first and foremost thing for an auditor, especially when he is doing the audit for the first time, is to know the nature of business of the entity. He has to create a master file containing certain vital information which would be useful not only for the current year audit, but it would be useful in future also. So, what he has to do is he has to have a thorough knowledge of the nature of business, how it is operating. Now, when you talk about nature of business, I have split this into various points. The first one is organization structure, he has to know about it. The second one is key personnel. The third one is the questionnaires which are to be issued to various departments. The fourth point is regarding obtaining some documents like memorandum and articles, and the next point is regarding the previous year audit report and financial statements. Now, we will very briefly discuss all these points one by one. The first point he has to know when he wants to create a master file is to have the organization structure. How is the concern organizationally structured? What is the hierarchy? Who is who in the organization? Who has got what powers? Especially relating to financial transactions. Is there a separate department for each of the functions? For instance, in a big company, you will have a sales department, you will have a marketing department, you will have a purchase department, you will have an inventory department separately. So, when these things are segregated, you ought to know as to what exactly is the function of each department, then who is holding key positions in the organization. If you have an audit question, if you want a clarification, then you should approach whom, which official you should approach. That is the key personnel. Now, once you know who is there in the organization, who is holding which position and what are his powers, the next point is the auditor generally gives a questionnaire to different departments to elicit information. For instance, he will give a questionnaire to the sales department as to how your particular department is structured. How are the financial transactions taking place in your organization? There will be 20 questions, 30 questions. The answers which the auditor gets for all these questions are very relevant in conducting the audit subsequently. So, each department would get a questionnaire from the auditor, and based on the questionnaire, based on the answers to the questionnaire which has been given, the auditor will form an idea as to what exactly is to be done, which area is weak, which area is strong, whether he should concentrate on all the areas equally, whether he should eliminate a few areas. That would be decided once he gets the answers from these various departments. Now, the next point is, when you are doing the audit of a company or a partnership firm or a proprietary concern, you need to have the basic documents. For instance, if you are doing the audit of a company, the basic document is the memorandum and articles of association of the company. Now, this document is very important because this will not only tell you as to when the company was formed, it would also give the objects of the company, why it was formed, what is its nature of activity, what is its nature of business. That is very important for you to begin the audit. It would also give the initial subscribers, the initial shareholders, the initial directors of the company, what are the rights and duties of the directors. All this information would be contained in the memorandum. Now, similarly, if you are doing the audit of a partnership firm, then the basic document is the partnership deed. Now, the deed would give the names, addresses of the partners, it would give the shareholding pattern, it would give where the registered office of the firm is situated, and it would also give you what is the nature of business of the partnership firm. So, this is all vital information. Auditor has to store this information in a master file. Similarly, if you are doing the audit of a trust, the audit of a charitable organization, of a society, then the bylaws of the society, the trust deed is a must. All these things would go into the master file of the auditor. This is part of the audit procedure. Unless he has all this information, he will not be able to proceed further with the audit, he will not be able to do the job, he would not be able to justify the job properly. So, all these documents would form part of the master file which has to be maintained by an auditor. The next point I have said is that every auditor, before he begins the audit, he has to go through the previous year audit report and the previous year financial statements. Now, the previous year audit report and the financial statements together with the notes thereon would throw up a lot of information on the entity. What is the nature of entity? What was its performance in the last year? Which is the area which is strong in this company? All this information you will find, the auditor will find in the financial statements of the last year. Similarly, as I said, every auditor has to go into the previous year's audit report. Now, he will have to look into the qualifications made by the auditor in the previous year, the notes which form part of the accounts. Those things also are to be taken into consideration. So, he has to obtain a copy of the previous year's audit report as well as the financial statements. Now, all these things which we have discussed, that is obtaining basic knowledge about the client's business, the client's organization structure, the key personnel, the basic documents like memorandum, partnership deed or a trust deed, and the previous year's audit report and financial statements. all these things would form part of the master file which every auditor will maintain. Now, once this job has been achieved, the next very important thing before an auditor goes into the actual audit part of it is that he has to study the internal controls existing in the company. Now, this is a very important area which no auditor would forget, which no auditor would give a go by, because in every organization there is an internal control, there is an internal check system which would be functioning. I will give you a small example as to how this internal control system actually works, how it has to be studied. I have taken the example of a ready-made garment dealer in the city. I have taken two different entities. There is one entity on one side which has say 5 salesmen and the proprietor, that is the boss. So, in the shop there are 5 salesmen who are actually showing the goods to the customers, who are making the bills, who are packing the material, and finally the boss sits on the cash counter to take the cash. Now, this is one system. Here there are several problems in the sense that internal controls may not be proper. The reason is that these 5 salesmen who are handling the actual sale, they are showing the goods to the customer, they are making the bill, they are packing the goods. At every point there can be a problem, there can be an error, there can be a fraud. A fraud is something which is done intentionally, an error is something which is not done intentionally. So, in this setup there can be a situation where all these 5 salesmen who are there, they can commit an error. While showing one piece of material, they may give the price of another piece. While packing the material, they may pack 2 pieces instead of 1 piece. If the material is priced at 500 rupees, they may bill at 400 rupees. Now, all these areas are weak points. The proprietor who is sitting on the cash counter, he is only taking care of the cash. Now, in this situation, all these weak points are to be noted. When the auditor takes up the audit, he has to see that yes, these are the areas where there are weaknesses. Now, is the proprietor doing anything to counter these weaknesses? Is he checking each and every material? Is he checking the price of each and every garment which is being sold? Is he checking the package of every customer so that no extra material goes? Now, if he is doing it, then yes, all the internal control procedures he is taking care of. But here also he may not be able to justify that in several situations, like in the festival season he may not be able to do that, which means that there is an inherent weakness in the internal control. Now, on the other hand, you take the example of a big garment, ready-made garment trader, where there are about 50 salesmen. There are about 50 salesmen who are in different wings of the shop. Somebody is taking care of the boys section, somebody is taking care of the gents section, somebody is taking care of the ladies section. Now, here in a big shop, I'll tell you how the internal control system works. Now, when a customer comes for any item, he goes to a salesman. The salesman will show different types of material. Once he shows that, his job is to convince the customer that yes, this is good for you. Once the customer is convinced, the job of the salesman is over. What he will do is, he will take the material, he will go to the billing department. In the billing department, the person sitting on the counter, he will make the bill depending on the material. Then this material, when he makes a bill, he will make 4 copies of the bill. 1 copy would be retained by the billing section, 2 copies would be given to the customer, and 1 copy it will go along with the material to the dispatch section. So, once again 4 copies have been made of the bill, 1 copy is retained by the by the billing counter, 2 copies are given to the customer, and the fourth copy it goes along with the material to the dispatch section. Now what does the customer do? The customer goes with these two bills to the cash counter, he makes payment, he gives both the bills, one bill is returned to him with a stamp cash paid and the other bill copy is retained by the cash counter. Now this copy which is returned to the customer, that copy would be carried by the customer to the dispatch section. Now when customer is going through this procedure, the material with one copy of the bill would be sent to the dispatch section, and in the dispatch section when the customer comes, he will come with a paid bill. Now that paid bill would be retained by the dispatch section and his material would be handed over. Now here we have seen that a perfect internal control system is functioning as far as sale is concerned, because the person who is showing the material, he is a salesman, his job is only to show the material and convince the customer that this is good. Once that is done, the bill is not done by him. So he has absolutely no control as to what bill is to be made. That will be made by the billing department. The billing department, it only makes the bill. It does not receive the cash, it does not deliver the material. So there is no question of taking any extra cash or lesser cash, and there is no question of giving any extra material, because the billing section person has no control over it. The cash section takes only cash, it does not do anything else, and it retains a copy of the bill. The dispatch section, that is the fourth one in the chain, it only dispatches the material. It takes the paid bill and it gives the material. So at all points, unless all these four people in different departments, they commit an error, the chances of an error taking place are very, very remote. And the chances of fraud are also very, very remote, because unless all these four people collude, there is no way a customer can be given material at a cheaper rate, or a customer gets say 2 pieces and he is billed only for 1. There is no possibility of all these things. So this is a very good example of how an internal control functions. Now here the proprietor, the owner, he does not have to really bother about each and every transaction. It is not possible also. So what he has to see is whether all these people are properly working or not, because he has already set up an internal control system which should function. So what the auditor will do is, he will see in each department what is the internal control system which is functioning. I have given you an example of the sales department. There can be an internal control system in the purchases department also. Again, it depends on the size of the organization, depends on the volume of transactions. If it is a big organization, then naturally the purchase department will also have a very good internal control system, like they would be floating tenders, they will be opening the quotations, there will be a separate committee which would be formed for purchases, they will open the quotations, they will see the criteria on which they have to make purchases, then they will place an order. So here the person who is indenting for the material, the person who is actually taking the quotations, the person who is opening the tenders, all are different people. So the chances of error again get reduced. So I have given you 2 examples where there is a perfect internal control system functioning. So what the auditor has to do is find out different areas where there are internal controls, and if there are internal controls, whether they are functioning properly or not. That is very important. If the auditor feels that there is a weak link in the entire internal control procedure, then he will formulate his audit program basing on what the weakness is. His thrust would be on the weak point. We will come to this point when we discuss the actual audit program. Now I have told you that what the auditor will do is, once the master file is created containing vital information, he will go through each organization to find out what is the internal control which is functioning. Now once this job is done, then the auditor, the senior auditor who actually has control over this audit, he will have to start forming an audit program. Now, what is an audit program? Again, this is a step which is just before the audit. Unless you have something charted out for you, it is not easy to do a good job. So, what the audit program does is, it will give in a nutshell what is to be done. Now, let us go through the points which have to be kept in mind when you are actually formulating, drafting an audit program. To prepare an audit program, what the auditor has to do is, he has to lay down as to what is the scope of his audit, what are the areas which are to be covered, and what is the extent to which they are to be covered. Then he also has to lay down what is the evidence required for each and every part of the audit. The third point is regarding allocation of work to his assistants. He has to decide as to what he himself has to do and what his assistants will do. Again, there will be a categorization. The senior assistant would be assigned a job which is more important. A junior assistant who has just started his training, he will be given routine checking jobs. So, he has to decide about the time schedule as well as the work allocation part. Then what he has to do is, what are the reporting requirements? He also has to lay down in the audit program that yes, this is an audit being conducted under the Companies Act. These are the legal requirements which are to be looked into. For instance, I will give you another example. If a person is doing an audit under the Income Tax Act, he will have to know certain provisions. So, unless the assistant, the audit assistant knows what are the legal requirements, what is the format of the audit report which ultimately has to be given, he will not be able to do a good job. So, he will have to, the audit program will have to lay down the reporting requirements also, the legal provisions which should be considered when he is actually doing the audit. Now, once these things are there, he will prepare an audit program. I have given you a small sample audit program. Now, this sample audit program has different columns. The first column is the nature of work, the second column is the scope, that is what is the scope of the work, whether you should do it 100%, whether you should do it for 6 months or 3 months or sample checking. The third column gives the number of days allotted for a particular work. The fourth column gives the number of days taken actually by the audit assistant. Then the next column gives the name of the person or persons who have actually done this work, and the last column is for remarks. Now, the audit, as I said, the audit program will also give the details of the work to be done. In my audit program, I have included these things: cash receipts and cash payments. The auditor thinks that entire 12 months are to be done. The time allotted is 2 days. Similarly, the next point is regarding bank receipts and payments. 6 months vouchers are to be vouched and the time allotted is only 1 day. The next point is sales. Here the auditor thinks that the first and last 3 months should be audited, should be vouched. Purchases, entire 12 months, because when studying the internal control systems, maybe the auditor thinks that this area is weak. So, let me do entire 12 months audit. So, this scope of audit is definitely dependent on the controls which are existing and which have been studied by the auditor. Similarly, journal entries, debit and credit notes, inventory, ledger scrutiny and finalization, each and everything is given a specific time. Now, once the audit program is prepared, work is allocated, people are allocated, time schedules are given, the actual audit work starts. Now, in this audit work, again there are different types of verification which are done by the auditor. The first one is the routine checking, that is every voucher is gone into by an assistant. Then there is test checking. If the auditor feels that no, 100% audit is not required, then he will go through these things on a random basis. He will pick up a few transactions, he will complete them right from the beginning till the end. Then there are surprise checks. For instance, when we are doing the audit of a bank, we do cash verification on a surprise basis. We do not inform the banker, we suddenly go there and ask for the cash. So, that is a surprise check. Then there is ledger scrutiny, which is very important. Each and every folio of the ledger, each and every account has to be gone through. Information from outsiders, from customers, from suppliers, the auditor has an authority to write directly to the customers asking for confirmation of balances. So, this is one type of verification. Then once all these basic things are done, the auditor will do a comparative analysis. A comparative analysis between 2 years, between 2 quarters or between 2 half years, that will throw up a lot of data on the variances, and then he can again concentrate on areas where there is a lot of variance. Then the next point is ratio analysis. This is also a very important tool, very important part of the audit procedure. He has to do that. Physical verification for cash, investment and stock, that also has to be carried out. Now, once all these things are done, the auditor will have all preliminary information with him. Based on this information, he will prepare an audit report. Now, the contents of the audit report would vary depending upon the nature of the audit. As I already told you in the beginning, if it is a company audit, if it is a statutory audit, there is a fixed format. If it is an audit under the Income Tax Act, there is a fixed format, there are fixed columns. You have to fill up those columns, and if the auditor wants to make a qualification, then in his main audit report he has to make a qualification. If he is not satisfied about anything, then he can give a disclaimer. He can say that no, I am unable to form an opinion, that is called a disclaimer. A qualification is slightly lesser or lesser than a disclaimer, because a disclaimer says that even though I have verified everything, I am not able to form any opinion, whereas a qualification would concentrate on a particular point, that I am not satisfied about these cash vouchers, I am not satisfied about inventory, but subject to this point the accounts give a true and fair view. So, when he drafts his audit report, he has to take into consideration all these things, and he also has to take into account all the legal provisions which must form part of his audit report. Now, in the case of a manufacturing company, if it is a private limited or a public limited company, there is a manufacturing and other companies auditors report order. Now, that has about 20 points. All those 20 points should be covered in his audit. On all those 20 points, he has to give a specific answer. That is part of his audit report. If it is any other audit, the sales tax audit or the cost audit or audit under the IT Act, again the formats are different. So, keeping in view all these formats, keeping in view the legal provisions, he will have to draft his audit report, and once he submits the audit report, his job is over. So, the procedure which starts with the appointment of the auditor would come to an end with giving of the report by the auditor.
మా కార్యక్రమాలపై మీ సూచనలు, సలహాలు, అభిప్రాయాలు మాకు తెలియజేయండి. మీ సూచనలు, సలహాలు, అభిప్రాయాలు మాకు తెలియజేయవలసిన చిరునామా: డైరెక్టర్, ఆడియో విజువల్ ప్రొడక్షన్ అండ్ రీసెర్చ్ సెంటర్, డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ ఓపెన్ యూనివర్సిటీ, ప్రొఫెసర్ జి రామరెడ్డి మార్గ్, రోడ్ నంబర్ 46, జూబ్లీ హిల్స్, హైదరాబాద్ 500033.
Welcome to today's program. Our program today deals with the concept of testing of hypothesis, which is a part of MBA first year management program. Management is a subject which deals with the allocation of scarce resources in all its functional areas like finance, production, personnel and marketing. Testing of hypothesis is a major statistical tool which helps us in decision making in all these areas. Today we have with us Professor SNN Pandit, who is a retired professor of statistics from Osmania University. He is right now working as Director, Center for Quantitative Methods, Usmania University. Sir, in an organization, a personnel manager would like to know the effectiveness of a training program he has undertaken for his staff, or in a survey, comparative analysis is usually done when a comparison is done between two schools regarding the performance of two schools. In such a case, how does testing of hypothesis help a person?
Suppose we take the first question into consideration. The question is, a training program is envisaged and we want to know whether this training is going to be useful or not in improving the skill of the persons who undergo this training. For this purpose, suppose there is no improvement, then what would happen? And if there is an improvement, what would happen? What we should expect? These things we should be able to make out. For example, about the skill that we want to see whether the training is going to improve or not, we should be able to measure the skill. For example, if it is a typing, you know what is the speed of typing with no mistakes. Now, in this case, before the training, you measure the skill of the person by seeing what is the speed of typing that the person has done and what is the number of mistakes that are committed. And after the training is over, the same person is given the same test, and then the performance is measured again by the speed acquired and by the number of mistakes that the person makes. Now, if the training is really helpful, what we should expect is, before the training, whatever was the speed, that should be now becoming more after the training. The speed should increase and the errors should not increase, but if at all, it should decrease. So, suppose we measure the two quantities, that is the quantity of what is the speed, that is the quantity we are using for measuring the skill. So, what is the speed before the training and what is the speed after the training? Now, if the training is having any effect, the before training value should not be more than the after training value, it should only be greater. If that is true, in a general sense, we can say that if a number of people are given the training and if most of the cases the score after the training is larger than the score before the training, then we can say that this has been of some use. So, the question is now, there are two numbers we can get for each person. Before training, what was the skill, at what level was the skill, and after the training, what was the level of the skill. Now, if these two we have for a number of people, we can take the difference between the two and see whether the difference is always a positive one or it is sometimes positive, sometimes negative, nothing very specific, in which case we have to say that the training has no impact. So, the formulation of the question is made more precise by saying we take the difference between the performance of the people before and after. The after training minus before training, what is the difference in the skill as measured by the score. This difference, is it 0 or is it not 0? In general, this is the way in which we can formulate the question. That is, we are testing a hypothesis, we are formulating a hypothesis that suppose there is no training effect, then the difference between the two on the average will be 0. And if this is not true, then what we should expect is that the difference will be a positive number if it is going to improve. So, that is how we have to formulate the hypothesis. In that, we state the hypothesis, we state this is likely to happen, and if it is likely to happen and if we conduct the experiment, that is here the training program, and measure some things, what will be the nature of those things, whether they will all be positive or negative or mostly positive, this sort of questions will have to be answered. On the basis of this, we can test whether our assumption that there is no effect, is it justified, or we should say that no, there is some improvement and there is not, it is not true that there is no effect. So, the hypothesis we have formulated is there is no effect of training, and if there is no effect of training, what we should expect is what is coming out of the data. By seeing this, we can decide whether this hypothesis is reasonable, or we should say that our assumption is not reasonable because what we expect according to this hypothesis is not what is actually coming.
How do we test the hypothesis that we have framed, sir?
Now, here the hypothesis we are framing is there is no effect of training, because that way we can say if there is no effect of training, what should be the nature of the outcome of this experiment, that is what is the value before, what is the value after. If this difference that is effectively 0, then we can say that the hypothesis that there is no effect is acceptable. So, that is what we have to examine. Therefore, here what we do is we take the two readings before and after, take the difference after minus before. So, if there are 10 people, we have got 10 values for each person, what is the difference? Now, is this difference on the average 0? If so, we can say that the hypothesis is accepted. That means there is no effect of training. But suppose there is really an effect of training, which of course is what we normally expect, then we should expect that most of the time the values of this difference will be positive. So, if we feel that most of the time it is positive, then we say that our hypothesis is not supported by the data. The purpose of this formulation is whatever hypothesis we make, we should be able to work out the consequences of what we should expect if we conduct the experiment and if the hypothesis is true. If the outcome is not tallying with what we expect, then we say that the hypothesis is not supported by the data, and hence we have to say that it is not appropriate to say that the hypothesis is acceptable. In other words, the hypothesis we have formulated as the so-called null hypothesis, the hypothesis being tested, that we are not accepting if what we get from the data is not what we expect if the hypothesis is true. That is the general idea of testing of hypothesis.
When we test a hypothesis, and what is the scope of we committing a error in the process?
See, in this example itself, suppose there are 10 people whom we have made to go for the training, and for each of these 10 people the difference is measured. Now, if out of these 10 people 4 or 5 people have a positive value of the difference and the remaining have a negative value of difference, what will you conclude? Will it not look like sometimes something it will be more, sometimes it will be less? It means on the whole there is not much of a effect. So, if that is what happens, we have to conclude that our hypothesis is acceptable, because our hypothesis that there is no improvement is supported by the data, because if that hypothesis is true, quite often it will be a little more or a little less, but there is no definite trend. But suppose out of the 10 people, 7 people or 8 people have an improvement, that is a positive difference, whereas only 2 or 3 may have a negative difference, or even if all of them are having a positive difference, then what is the conclusion we can draw? It is not what we expect if there is no effect. So, we start with the assumption that there is no effect. If there is no effect and if we take the differences, what is it that we should expect? We should expect the differences to be sometimes positive, sometimes negative. On the whole, it is nearly 0. If that is not what we get, then we say that our hypothesis is not supported by the data. Then we say that the hypothesis is not acceptable. We therefore reject the hypothesis as not reasonable. The question now comes up whether 5 and 5 should be taken as the level, or 4 and 6 may be taken, or 8 and 2 may be taken. How do we decide it? That is where the question comes up. If always we are sure that the same thing will come, then there is no need for any testing. But when the outcomes are not guaranteed to be exactly of one type, then sometimes a positive value will come, sometimes a negative value will come. In that case, what will happen? It is just like tossing a coin. If a coin is tossed 10 times, how many heads do we expect? We would expect around 5. But does it mean that exactly 5 will come whenever you toss a coin 10 times? No, is it not? But round about 5 is what we expect, maybe 4 or 6, maybe 3 or 7, maybe even 2 or 8, rarely. But almost surely we will say that if 10 times we toss a coin, all 10 times we get only heads. That is very unlikely, is it not? If the coin is an ordinary coin, then it is very unlikely that we get all 10 heads out of 10. So, when we decide about a hypothesis to be tested and decide that this is the experiment we make, what are the possible results? Various alternatives are possible, but among all these possibilities, some of them we expect to be occurring more often and some things we expect not to occur at all, though technically it is possible, but it should be very rarely occurring. So, what we do is, out of the possible outcomes under the hypothesis, some are considered as very reasonable and some are very unreasonable, that is, they are so rare that when they occur you doubt that the hypothesis is true. So, that is the whole idea of a testing of hypothesis. Here some values of the outcome, they are treated as acceptable and reasonable, and some other possible values we think as not reasonable at all. So, if first we decide, if we conduct this experiment and if we get what sort of results we think that the results are reasonable and what sort of results are not reasonable, that is what we have to decide. So, once we decide it, then we conduct the experiment and say, because the results are what we expected, we accept the hypothesis, or if it is the other way, if the results are not what we expected, then we say that the hypothesis is not acceptable. So, that is how we have to decide, and it is here the question of significance tests will come and significance level will come. So, what amount of reasonableness we should accept? What is meant by saying that it is a reasonable thing? When we toss a coin 10 times, that is equivalent to saying the training is no use at all. If that is the case, when we take a person, what is the chance that his skill improves or the skill has not improved, or that is whether it is improving or whether it is not improving, that is either it is positive or negative, or equivalently tossing it is head or tail. In that case, what is it we expect out of 10 people? There we have to go for a probability distribution. What is the chance of getting so many heads when I toss a fair coin? So, that binomial distribution possibly you remember. So, that will tell if the chance of successes are half and half, success and failures they are half and half, then 5 is what we normally expect. On the average we get 5 successes, but 4 and 6 etc., they will all have a particular chance. So, what is the chance of getting anything from 3 to 7 successes? That if it is fair enough, we can say around 90% of times it will come like this. Then we say that there is a 90% chance that if our assumption is true, that the coin is unbiased, in other words that the training is no use, then chance of getting a head or a tail or equivalently a positive or a negative thing, they will be half and half, and therefore we should expect that out of 10, anything from 3 to 7 heads or 3 to 7 positive differences, that should be reasonable. So, anything other than this, that is if you get only 2 heads or 1 head or no head at all, then you say that there is something wrong with the coin that I am using. I am assuming that the coin is fair, maybe it is not fair. Equivalently here, the training we thought it is going to improve, we thought that it is not having an effect. Now, if it is more than 2 heads, say more than less than 2 heads, that means it is a rare event, or similarly more than 8 heads, it is a rare event. In either of these 2 cases, we have to say that there is not justifiable to say that there is no effect at all. If there is no effect at all, we should have got the number of positive and positive differences anything from 3 to 7. If anything other than that comes, it means there is an effect. Now, the question is whether it is a positive effect or a negative effect. If it is a positive effect, we expect that the positive numbers will come higher. Then we say that the null hypothesis is not accepted, but the alternative that there is an effective improvement, that will be accepted. But suppose it is the other way around, then it means the training is counterproductive, whatever skill was there is destroyed. So, that is how we test the hypothesis, by first formulating a null hypothesis, that is saying this is what we expect, this is what is supposed to happen. And if this is what is supposed to happen, that is the null hypothesis is true, then if I conduct an experiment or do some observations, what is it I should expect to see? These are various alternatives possible. Some of the alternatives we take as reasonable at a given level of probability, say 90% reasonableness, 90% chance that it will come like this. Then when the outcome is like this, we say that the hypothesis is accepted. If the outcome is outside of this range, outside of these reasonable outcomes, when the outcome is unreasonably rare, then we say that the hypothesis is not accepted. That is the basic idea of a significance level which is the complement of the degree of reasonableness. If it is 90% reasonable, we say that the 10% significance we say. That is, what is the chance that it is significantly different from what we expect. That is what we call as the significance level, which is complementary to what is the reasonableness we expect. So, that is how we go about it. For this, the basic requirement is then we should formulate the hypothesis, define the possible outcomes, and on the basis of some probability theory or so, we should decide what is the reasonable range of outcomes and what is the region of unreasonable outcomes. That we should decide. Once we decide it, the unreasonable outcomes, if they come in the experiment, we say that the hypothesis is not supported, so we do not accept the hypothesis. Otherwise, we say that the hypothesis is accepted.
What is the alternative hypothesis that is also used in this regard?
See, if we take the null hypothesis, the hypothesis on the basis of which we are saying whether what we are getting is reasonable or not. If that is not accepted, then what to do? There, if suppose we say that the training is not useful, that is the null hypothesis, that is neither useful nor harmful, it is just no use. That was our hypothesis. Now, if it is not true, if it is not acceptable, then what is the conclusion we should draw? There are two possibilities. We may say there is an improvement, or we may say that even though it is not improving, it has even deteriorated. The training has become a negative sort of thing. These are various possibilities. But usually what we have is the null hypothesis is one thing we are in a position to test. Then we have also in mind what is the other possibility. If this is not true, what is the other possibility? That is what is usually called as the alternative hypothesis. So, when we say that this is a null hypothesis, we also have in mind an alternative hypothesis. If I do not accept this, I would rather go for the other one as true. Usually, that is where the question comes. Suppose we say that the training is useful. If it is not harmful or if it is not useful, then it is a null hypothesis, we are saying. But if this is not accepted, then what is it I should accept? Should I say that it is helpful? So, that will be the alternative hypothesis I have in mind. In which case, what I should think is, suppose the null hypothesis is not accepted, then what can I say about the alternative hypothesis? If the alternative hypothesis is true, would we accept that what we have observed would have come? That is the thing we have to ask. Just like we say, if the null hypothesis is true, what is it we should expect? Similarly, if null hypothesis is not true, then if the alternative hypothesis we have in mind is to be true, then what is it we should expect? Is it acceptable? What we have got as the data, is it acceptable with the alternative hypothesis? That is the idea we should have in mind. So, what we normally do is, we start with a null hypothesis where usually it is a negative sort of thing, that is no effect, that sort of thing, because that is more easy to measure what will be the consequences of no effect. Then we have, if this is not acceptable, then we should expect that there will be an improvement. That will be our alternative. And we can say the improvement will be say 10% improvement, some such thing we have to say. If the improvement is so much, then what is it we should have expected? That is one thing we will keep in mind. So, when the null hypothesis is not acceptable, then we go for the alternative hypothesis and say that the alternative is acceptable. But there, in this case, it would be an improvement, or the alternative may be a deterioration. So, what we do is, if the alternative is true, what is the chance of getting what we have observed? That is the other question that we have to keep in mind. Now, the testing should be such that when the alternative hypothesis is true, the null hypothesis should not be accepted most of the time. But if the alternative hypothesis were taken, that would have been more reasonable. That is the sort of thing. But what can actually happen in many cases, because it is a question of chance what we get. Sometimes when the hypothesis is true, you may get an unreasonable outcome. Maybe there is no effect, but still out of the 10 people, 8 of them have got a better score. It is not impossible. Then what will happen? Because of our rule, we are accepting the hypothesis that there is no effect. So, that means they are committing one type of error, is it not? Yeah. That is what is called the type 1 error or error of type A. When the null hypothesis is true, we decide on the basis of the outcome that the null hypothesis is not accepted. That is one type of error. but it can also be the other way around, is it not? In the alternative hypothesis, if the alternative hypothesis is actually true, that is the null hypothesis is not true, but the alternative is true. But even then what can happen? The outcome may suggest that the null hypothesis is acceptable, in which case we are making a reverse type of error. That is what is called the type 2 error or the error of type B.
That is the same as beta error.
That is the error of type B. That beta is the chance of that mistake, or the alpha is the chance of making the mistake of one type. That is chance of saying when the hypothesis is true, saying that it is not true. That is what is called usually alpha. The other one is when the alternative is true, accepting the null hypothesis. That is what is called the type 2 error. This chance is what is called beta. That is the general idea.
That is, the probability of the occurrence of error is called beta.
Yes, probability of the error of accepting the null hypothesis when the alternative is true. That is the thing. So, naturally, if the alternative goes on changing, this probability goes on changing. So, if the error does not occur, then it is the correct thing, it is the complement. So, if the null hypothesis is not accepted, when the alternative hypothesis is true, that will be the correct thing, and that is what is called the power of the test at that alternative. So, 1 minus the power is the beta or the error of type 2, that is the thing. So, type 1 error is when the null hypothesis is true, your decision rule says do not accept the hypothesis. The other alternative is when the null hypothesis is not true, but the alternative hypothesis is true. What is the chance of your concluding that the null hypothesis is true? That is what is called the type 2 error, for which the probability is beta. Naturally, if the alternative is differing, the probabilities also change. So, for different alternatives, you will get different values of beta. So, if you take 1 minus beta, that is what is called the power of the test at that alternative. So, as the alternative goes on changing, the power also will change. So, though we develop the theory mostly on the basis of the null hypothesis, very often the alternative hypothesis is most important. And if the alternative hypothesis is true, then the chance of accepting the null hypothesis should be made as small as we can make it. Similarly, when the null hypothesis is not true, we should not accept the null hypothesis. That is the type 1 error we should minimize. So, these two are complementary type of things. So, the rule should be such that when we take the hypothesis, we should specify what should be the outcome. Specify means not the particular outcome, what are the possible outcomes with what chances. That is the measurement of to decide whether to accept or not to accept. On the basis of the measurements or counts or observations we make, we will then go for deciding whether to accept or not. Once we decide this, whatever decision we take, it can be either correct in 2 ways or wrong in 2 ways. The correct in 2 ways means when the null hypothesis is true, we may decide that it is acceptable, and when the alternative is true, we may decide that the null hypothesis is not true and hence the alternative is correct. These are the 2 correct alternatives possible. Similarly, the other 2 mistakes are there. That is the 2 types of errors. That is the idea of the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, and the error of type A and error of type B.
Can you just explain the level of significance in the critical region under the normal probability curve?
See, usually when I take the standard normal distribution, around 95% of the time, we can expect the value to be between minus 1.96 to plus 1.96. Therefore, if I take, suppose I want to test this hypothesis, I want to test the hypothesis that the average mu is equal to 30. Suppose this is what I want to test. Some measurements are taken and we want to test whether the measurements on the average can be equal to 30. We are assuming that the measures are following a normal distribution.
And mu is the population mean.
Mu is the population mean. That is, the population average, grand average is supposed to be 30. That is what we want to test. For that purpose, we have selected some 5 or 10 observations, and we have got x bar, the average of these things.
Average of the sample.
Average of the sample. So, the sample x bar will not be always mu. In general, it will never be true.
There may be a difference.
A lot of fluctuations will be there. When you go on taking different samples, you get different things. So, if your assumption that the population mean is mu is true, what can we say about the sample mean? About the sample mean, we can conclude that sample mean also should have a theoretical average equal to 30. When I say that the theoretical average is 30, it means the actual values will be hopefully around 30, but not very far from it. But how far is far enough? That is the basic question. For that, the mean is not enough. We should also have what is the standard deviation, how much of fluctuation we should expect in general. And for that, what is it we require? What we require is that if you take the x values, various observations, they are scattered around 30 if it is true. But how much is the scatter? That is measured by sigma. And if that sigma is taken for individual values, suppose the sigma is equal to 4. That is for individual values, the scatter will be 30 plus or minus some things, and the far away it is from 30, the less is the chance, and that 4 is the measure of scatter, which is defined as the standard deviation.
Standard. As we conclude today's session, thank you very much, sir, for giving us details regarding the testing of hypothesis and all its major concepts like null hypothesis, alternative hypothesis, etc. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
మా కార్యక్రమాలపై మీ సూచనలు, సలహాలు, అభిప్రాయాలు మాకు తెలియచేయండి. మీ సూచనలు, సలహాలు, అభిప్రాయాలు మాకు తెలియజేయవలసిన చిరునామా: డైరెక్టర్, ఆడియో విజువల్ ప్రొడక్షన్ అండ్ రీసెర్చ్ సెంటర్, డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ ఓపెన్ యూనివర్సిటీ, ప్రొఫెసర్ జి రామరెడ్డి మార్గ్, రోడ్ నంబర్ 46, జూబ్లీ హిల్స్, హైదరాబాద్ 500033.